morning, everyone. This hearing is called to order. I recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members, members of the committee in attendance who are present today, or co-chair, vice chair, Councilmember Brian O'Neill, Councilmember Cindy Bass, Councilmember Derek Green, Councilmember Davey Go.
I can't hear Tom.
Councilmember Helen Kemp.
We lost you a little bit there, Councilmember, after Derek Green.
Oh. Councilmember Derek Green, Councilmember Jamie Gautier, Councilmember Mark Squilla, Councilmember Maria Quinones Sanchez, Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson, and Councilmember Helen Kemp. Audio okay?
Yeah, that was better. That was good.
Public of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility. The purpose of the public hearing is to hear testimony and resolution 004. Resolution with co-sponsors, Council Members Parker, Councilmember King, Councilmember Jonas Sanchez, Councilmember Squilla, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson, Councilmember Bass, and Councilmember Thomas. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We're using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on the phlcouncil.com. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before the committee today. Laurel, I think you might.
Sorry about that. Good morning. Authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impacts of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I also want to recognize our Majority Leader, Councilmember Sherelle Parker, for joining. And Ms. Gerbeck, please call the first panel of witnesses.
Harvey Rice, Rob DeBoe, Marissa Waxman.
Okay. I'm going to ask everyone to hold their questions until everyone's given testimony. Mr. Rice, maybe you'd like to start.
Councilman Dom and the members of the City Council Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation Committee. As you know, my name is Harvey Rice. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, which is a state oversight agency for the City of Philadelphia. Again, thank you for allowing me to testify at this quarterly meeting to speak about PICA's report on the quarterly City Manager's report for the second quarter of fiscal year 2021, which encompassed the months of October, November, and December of 2020, and PICA's reports on city revenues, obligations for January, as well as overtime costs through January. I've prepared a short PowerPoint presentation with the highlights of our report on the QCMR, as well as the synopsis of our revenue, budget obligations, and overtime reports. So the first slide shows you, shows everyone what the numbers reveal in the QCMR for quarterly 2. The quarter ended with a fund balance of $29.1 million, which was lower than the projected fund balance in the plan, which was submitted back in June of 2020, which was $51.3 million. However, it increased from the first quarter, which was at $22.8 million. So the fund balance has increased within one quarter. However, it's below the 5-year plan projection, and still below what we had said in our staff report on the plan back in July, where we would have liked to see fund balances at a higher level, and the city was achieving that, giving up until the COVID pandemic. Revenues are 4.6 billion, and obligations are at 2.3 billion. Oh, I'm sorry, revenues were 1.6 billion. The plan projection is 4.6 for the year. Next slide shows in further detail the projected revenues and obligations. As you can see, the plan projection was at 4.5 billion. The 2021 quarter two projection is at 4.6 billion. That includes approximately 76 million of CARES funds. If you take away the CARES funding, we're actually below about 55 million than projected in the plan. Obligations, even though revenues are decreasing over the projections as well as FY20, obligations are increasing, and as a result, we've been following the budget obligations spending by month for this fiscal year since the pandemic. So this is the summary. As I said, revenues are projected to increase by 20.6 million from the 5-year plan. Obligations are projected to increase by almost 130 million from the plan. So these and part of these obligations are due to the expenses of COVID-19 on the city and its impact. Projected revenues are to decrease by 40.8 million from the 5-year plan, and locally generated non-tax revenues projected to decrease by over 10 million. But other revenues, this is the 71.6 million. I said 75 earlier, it's 71.6 from the CARES Act. This slide details our projected obligations by class, the class is wages, employee benefits, purchases of services, going down, debt service, and it goes from the plan to the second quarter, and the amount changed from the original plan to the second quarter projections. Staffing has decreased through quarter two and FY21 by 542 full-time employees. This is mainly due to some layoffs, attrition, as well as the hiring freeze. But however, overall staffing has increased from pre-recession levels of 2009. Overtime, as you know, the PICA and its board is very concerned about the rising overtime costs that we have seen year after year. We were through the first quarter, we were encouraged that overtime was decreasing. I think at that time by like 7 or 8 percentage points, but now it's lower than 2%, and these costs are before the January and February storms. Okay, city tax revenues through January. This is a more up-to-date than what was in the QCMR, because we follow the revenues every month as well as we follow the obligations every month. The city collected approximately 246.545 million in general fund tax revenue in 2021. If you compare that to last last January. I'm sorry, there was an October there, of approximately 77.2 million, or 23.9%. But there was about a $30-some million payment that came in February that should have been attributed or accounted for in January. So that percent would be lower. So our tax collections decrease about 200 million, or 11.7%. And the only tax category to increase year to date is the BERT tax, which is, as you well know, is one of the most difficult taxes to predict. So this shows you, this chart shows the FY 2021 revenues, January 2020, and the change, and then the year to date, and also the change. So it gives you, gives everyone a little snapshot picture of what is occurring with our revenues. And then again, we also looked at the obligations through January, and city expended almost 2.3 billion, and encumbered an additional almost 318 million, amounting to almost 2.6 billion. That's 53.2% of the 4.8 billion spending budget, which is lower than if the city doesn't budget by month, but if you divide that by 12 months, it would have been 58.3%. So they're about 5% lower. Now this is January. This doesn't, and we'll be following February's. We'll be getting them very soon. And it might be the storms and the cleaning up of the storms might impact that number come February. So as always, we're keeping a close eye on that. There's 12 departments who have the highest budget accounts, and they spend almost 2.3 billion so far, the total obligations. And then this is just a slide to show council that city departments overtime through January of 2020 and through January of 2021, their overtime cost each year, whether they're over and under. Now, we need to be just cautioned here that you'll see some departments with high numbers. That's because they let the city commissioners borrow their employees for the presidential election, and those numbers have not been attributed back to or transferred back to the commissioner's office. So you'll see high numbers, but that really doesn't reflect. And until that transfer is made to the city commissioner's office, and we'll get a better picture of the overtime spending in those departments.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask for a point of clarification for Mr. Royce?
Sure.
So you just mentioned the 12 departments. Were those 12 departments the ones, can you just run through the 12 departments? Are they the ones right here on this page? The previous one? Well,
it's this, for overtime or obligations, I'm sorry, Councilwoman.
The 12 departments with the highest budgets. Is this the list of the 12 departments with the highest budgets?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry. And that ends my presentation. As always, I'm here to answer any questions you may have regarding the presentation or anything else on revenues, obligations, and the quarterly report.
Okay, thank you, Harvey. I just wanted to clarify something, if I could. On that overtime report, it looked to me like the biggest issue there was fire at 7 million.
Yes, okay. It is, Council.
We'll come back to that. Let's go to Rob DeBell, our Finance Director.
Morning, Chair Dom, and members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today on Resolution 200406 regarding the current fiscal position of the city and our recovery efforts. I'm joined by Sarah DeWolf, our Recovery Officer and Deputy Finance Director for Policy and Practice, and Marissa Waxman, who is our Budget Director. We'll now share slide deck submitted with this testimony, and Marissa and I will walk you through it. And Marissa had shared it, so it's up on the screen. The first couple of slides go through how our $439 million fund balance morphed into a $29 million fund balance. We start by looking at our revenues, and Harvey talked a little bit about how those are higher than the adopted budget, but less than FY20. The reason that they're higher is that we use some of the CRF money, coronavirus relief money, to offset some of our costs as allowed under the Act. Our expenses are higher than projected, and that is largely related to the pandemic, and Marissa will go through that in more detail later. That leaves us with a very small fund balance of $29 million, which is less than 3 days worth of spending. It's far below our internal goal of between 6 and 8%, where we had gotten before the pandemic hit, and much less than the 17% recommended by the Government Finance Officers Association. And we have never gotten close to that number. That takes us to slide 3, which walks through progression of our fund balance. By the end of FY19, through really years of hard work, we had built up our fund balance to $439 million. You can see that was even slightly above our goal of being between 6 and 8%. The top end of that goal would have had us at about $380 million, but way below where the GFOA recommends we should be, which would be at about would have been about $811 million in FY19. By the end of FY20, we've already started to see the impact of the pandemic, and you can see that our fund balance had dropped from 439 to 291, and that was just slightly below the bottom of where we wanted to be. But by the end of this year, we project that we'll be at 29 million, way below where we should be, below where the GFOA says we should be, and as I said before, equal to only about 3 days worth of our obligations. Marissa's going to walk you through the next set of slides, give some more specifics on our revenues and expenditures. So that takes us to slide 4.
Great, thank you, Rob. So here's a bit more detail on our general fund revenues through the second quarter of the year. Through the second quarter, they're about $28 million lower than our original projections, but we still are projecting for the end of the year to be about $20 million higher. And that trade-off is because on the one hand, we've had to reduce some of our tax revenue estimates. Primarily, we've taken down since last quarter our wage tax by $16 million, as well as significant reductions from our parking and amusement taxes. Obviously, those are very pandemic related. Our parking tax, we get large chunks of that from the stadiums and from the airport. And so while people aren't flocking to those locations, those are going down, as well as our amusement tax. Over 80% of that comes from professional sporting event tickets. And so that has not recovered. We had initially thought we would have a rotten first quarter to this fiscal year, then get better. Obviously, now that we're into the third quarter, we haven't seen that yet and had to bring those down. That is, our tax collection reductions in our projections are somewhat offset by bringing money in from the grants fund, from our Coronavirus Relief Act funds. And so we do get a bit of an offset from increasing our revenue from other governments, which allows us to be overall up 20 million despite those reductions in our tax collections. And that is also based on our collections experience year to date and updated projections from the city's economic consultants at IHS Markit and other sources. And here it shows you a little bit more of what's happening year to date. So you can see our tax collections are actually up so far, but that's more of a timing issue on some things. As Harvey mentioned, the BERT's really unpredictable, but the added bonus this year is that we got a bunch of it in July because of the late due date instead of having it due last April. But you can see that our sort of fee and fine revenue is under our original projections, our revenue from other governments. And then when you look at that revenues from other funds, that 34 million coming in, no change there. That is us pulling 100% of our rainy day fund money out and back into the general fund. Our general fund obligations for the quarter are about 10 million more than the adopted budget. And that's basically due to, as Harvey noted, the 2020 presidential election, the continued public health crisis. And, we've had costs not just to respond to the pandemic itself, but it has increased costs for just doing the core government services we've always done. We've talked before about the impact on residential trash tonnage and what that means for our waste disposal fees. So our year-end projections are expected to be about $129 million more than the original budget. Those are, of that 129, 50 million is expected to be from additional COVID relief costs on the second half of the year. That's the that's currently under consideration. But also, as noted, we have additional costs related to personnel, the additional business relief that was allocated when council passed the last mid-year transfer ordinance, those election costs, and again, those pesky waste disposal fees. So year to date, some of this is then driven overtime. In general, we are still on track to have less overtime this year than we did last year, but it is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of our frontline agencies, particularly ones that are dealing with the pandemic response, those continue to be up. But some other departments, because of activities not happening, particularly driven by special events, it's not. So we're projecting to be a bit lower. And so we're about $8 million below where we were this time last year in terms of overtime. And so one of the things to think about when you're thinking about overtime is, what does leave usage look like? And again, here we have a mixed bag, because you have to think about, how many folks are available for work. And in some agencies, the work can wait until people return. In other agencies, we're not going to tie ourselves into pretzels trying to figure out how we're going to send, an ambulance 3 days from now when folks are back. And so what we have seen is that overall, our median leave usage is down this year. But those frontline agencies, it's up, the ones most engaged in the pandemic response, but it's down for some of the more back office functions. And so we're not really surprised by that, given the impact of COVID-19 on employees' health, the need for caring for children or family members, quarantine and isolation requirements where the work still has to be done. Other folks like me now, if the boiler repair guy has to come, I'm not taking an afternoon off work. I just let him in the house. So there's not that I get paid overtime or whatever, but you get the point that there's, depending upon the nature of work, the impacts of COVID is either increasing our need for overtime as a result of leave usage or decreasing. This is also impacted by the number of folks we have on staff. And as Harvey mentioned, we're in a hiring freeze. We've had attrition. And so, our adopted budget had the general fund at just under 24,000 positions. But our actuals right now are just over 22,000 and in the general fund. And that's a decrease of 340 in full-time positions since the first quarter. About 20% of that decrease since the first quarter is in the police department. The rest of it's pretty spread out. We also see a decrease of about close to 3% since this time last year. And so all of the different factors that Harvey mentioned are at play there. So performance measures, when we track the QCMR, we're looking at where's the money, how are we spending, what's coming in, what's coming out. But we also want to know, what are we getting for that money? That is another thing that has been really hard to negotiate in the pandemic. So we've got 109 performance measures that we report quarterly in the QCMR. There's over 500 that appear in the 5-year plan. But the ones we track quarterly and report that way, about close to 2/3 are still on track. 34 not on track, and 6 measures are not available at this time. And obviously COVID's having quite an impact on these. So looking at some of the ones that are on track, the number of households we're providing homeless prevention assistance to is on track. The time frame for residential permanent assistance in L&I is on track, as well as the number of cleanups from CLIP. Those are all doing great. But some of the ones where we've struggled so far this year, streets, earlier in the year, we had real challenges with all on-time recycling collection and on-time trash collection. However, you can see we have made tremendous strides in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. 164% increase over the first quarter on recycling, 200% increase over the first quarter in trash pickup. So, still not knocking it out of the park, 100% on-time collection, but a tremendous improvement over where we were when we really struggled. Other programs, because of closures and changes in operations, there are some challenges. So children and adults attending free library programs, obviously that has a whole different look than when, in years past. And so a lot of variation there in our performance measures. I encourage you to dig in the QCMR. As Harvey mentioned, we're now really closely tracking our spending month to month. And I will say that because of timing issues, month to month, we don't spend 1/12 of our budget every month. There are things that happen at certain times of year. There's certain seasonality, but this gives us a real opportunity as a sort of early warning system, red flag. And so, for example, in here, you might go, oh my goodness, why is all other classes $35 million over budget for the month of January? Well, it's because we made a $44 million debt service payment a few days early. It was initially scheduled or planned out in our cash flow for February. We made it in January. So we're not worried about that, but this is a good sort of gut check to see what's going on. Similarly, in the class 100, you're like, wow, how are we $83 million under budget for January? Well, that's because actually December had 3 pay periods, which then, just once that timing smooths out, January won't have as many. So we see that variation. We'll follow up on it if it looks funky, but just because it looks funky doesn't necessarily on a month-by-month basis mean there is a challenge. And so this shows you how a bunch of different departments are doing in terms of their year-to-date obligations, how much they've spent. And so some of these, and when this is obligations, this is both money actually expended, dollars out the door, as well as dollars encumbered, stuff we know that we're going to spend. And so Commerce, which includes a $15 million subsidy to the convention center, they encumber that $15 million very early in the year. So it looks like they've spent the majority of their budget, July 1. Similarly with the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, they encumber most of their funds for their providers early in the year. So you can see them edging up to close to 100% of their budget spent. Some other ones are sinking fund commission. We do most of our payments at the end of the year. But it's good to see that most of the others that don't have those real seasonality things going on, right at that 58% level of where you would expect to be 7/12 through the year. You'll actually even notice that City Council in this one, which is through the end of January, is actually only at 22%. And that's because of the timing of when that new normal money is coming out. You'll see that shoot up in the coming months as those dollars go out or transferred to other departments that are going to push them out. And then here's just a snapshot at the class 100. This is the one where you actually want to pay a little more attention of, is it on track to be 7/12 of the year? Granted, again, some seasonality with some departments, but we see things a lot closer here to being just on track for 7/12 of spending. We ask a few questions if things look out of alignment here. So that was FY21, but now we've started to look ahead to FY22. And we have some concerns. And so I think it was early last week or possibly the week before, we started talking about the possibility of a budget gap in FY22. What we did is we looked at how much money we would go into the year with, the $29 million fund balance that we plan to end FY21. We looked at our preliminary revenue estimates for FY22. And so altogether, that's about $4.7 billion. And so if we wanted to end FY22 would say even just a very modest $50 million fund balance, we'd only be able to spend about $4.67 billion. Unfortunately, when we look at the cost to deliver our current level of services in FY22, that adds up to $5.1 billion. So the difference between the current level of services at $5.1 billion and the revenues and fund balance we'll have available to us of $4.7 indicates a potential budget gap of $450 million. Now, what this doesn't include is any potential additional federal relief from new coronavirus rescue packages. And so we can't build those in until they are passed into federal law. We can't count on those while they're still speculative, but obviously we're really hopeful about those so that we can help partially address this. And so, that is just one, that federal stimulus or federal relief packages is just one of our uncertainties, but obviously we're still looking at the path of the virus, vaccine distribution, that impact on economic conditions. We have all 4 labor contracts expiring at the end of this fiscal year that we'll need to have new collective bargaining agreements. We have, tremendous fixed and inflexible costs. And we're concerned about school district finances. They actually have gotten some really great federal relief lately, but they have had long time structural challenges, and with what that means right now and the future economic vitality of the city, their challenges are in some ways our challenges. So the origins of how we got into this pickle are, probably not a surprise. That low starting fund balance, we're only going in with 29%, less than 3 days worth of spending, when, a city with a budget our size should really have 800 million, $450 million budget gap when things are bad would be a lot less painful if we'd been able to be at that GFOA recommended level of fund balance. The other origins are that our revenues are just not bouncing back. We are expecting some improvement over FY21, but not getting back to FY20 levels. And even FY20 levels weren't as good as we would have hoped because it had that last terrible quarter. And then increased costs. There are some things in our base budget that are just going up. We've got our fixed and inflexible costs. We've made some commitments, and there's just some cost increases. So I mentioned the changes and these are early preliminary revenue projections we've done with IHS, and I'll direct your attention to the bottom right corner. Basically, it's saying, as I mentioned, that we think that our revenues will go up by about $49 million, so that's better. But unfortunately, that's still $140 million less than FY20. So we're not even back to FY20, which again had one really not great quarter. And so as we're figuring out what is in that base budget for next year, that $5.1 billion that our current revenue projections won't quite cover, it mostly assumes same costs for services as FY21. But that's tricky when some of the areas the FY21 budget isn't quite sufficient. So, as Harvey mentioned, we're still going to be looking at, what was the impact of those storms in February. We always set aside a snow reserve. It's based on, prior year experience. But what happens when you have a year that is much bigger than the average of the past couple of years? We made a very few restorations of cuts to FY21. Most of them are not. It does remove some one-time costs, but there's going to be some disagreement and some conversation back and forth about should some of those one-time costs have been recurring. So here's, some commitments and some expectations we have as we move into FY22. Even with federal stimulus or federal relief, we do anticipate that cuts will be needed. So, there's certain areas where we have additional cost insurance. The costs of the city's insurance for cyber terrorism and things like that are going up. Just as the world gets more uncertain, insurers are, feeling a little less confident. In our area of homeless services and some other areas in FY21, we were able to reduce spending because we got federal grants that were specific for those particular services, like the Emergency Solutions Grant. So we were able to reduce the general fund contribution. It was backfilled with federal dollars. If those federal dollars don't recur, we need to figure out what do we want to do there. And we're also going to have a lot of backlogs, work that needs to get done eventually, but couldn't be done as we're in this pandemic state, especially impactful within our court system. Since we know that this is going to be a challenging budget, but just also since it is something we are building into our practice, we are thinking about racial equity as we navigate all of the decisions we want to make. We want to make sure that our process is more inclusive and equitable. And so we've made some changes to who's involved in generating and vetting the ideas. That's included internal and external focus groups. We've got a budget equity committee that looks at the racial disparity impacts of various proposals that we're looking at. We've got a survey that we did in multiple languages that we've gotten more than 13,000 responses on at this point. We've also just built into our process more sort of targeted focus on this. So there are questions about racial equity in all of the forms that departments fill out when describing their current operations, requests for new money, and potential reductions. We've integrated the OEO goal setting process into our budget process so that when we're having those conversations about how we're going to spend money, we're really at the same time having the conversations about how we're going to spend money with minority-owned, women-owned, disabled-owned businesses. And so we've made our process more inclusive, and that's part of it. And we also then want to make sure that the decisions we're making have better results in terms of the outcomes. And so that's for the whole budget, but there are also some areas where we just really want to make sure that we have a more inclusive and engaging approach. And so we've also launched participatory budgeting, which will for $1 million for capital projects, really turn that over to community members. Right now, we're in the process of co-designing a process with a steering committee of community members about how we will sort of throw open the gates for the general public to make recommendations on how to spend that $1 million. Then there will be a process with community members known as budget delegates to sort of vet that down, winnow it down to a dozen, 2 dozen really good viable options that'll then go out for public vote. And at that point, those are the projects that get funded. This is, we're using mayoral ITEF dollars, so it does not require any additional transfer ordinances or mayoral sign-off. So really puts that in the hands of the public. But looking at this budget gap, we realize that there's a lot we need to do other than just simply hoping for federal relief. So we're looking at, the strategies out there using or reducing reserves. The trouble there is that well is dry. We've already done that. Rob showed, the reduction in our fund balance. Shifting costs to other sources, grants, philanthropy, private sector, relying on other city funds. We can kick the can, hope that there's some things that even though we know we need to do them sometime, that we can put them off for a little bit longer. Things like refinancing debt, that's something that we are doing this year, deferring tech costs, seeing if we can stretch out the useful life of some of our equipment longer. We might get out of the business of providing some services, and allow the private sector to meet needs if those needs are there. There's finding efficiencies, consolidating functions, doing our hiring freeze, asking for reduced fees and costs from vendors. We've already had good success there in terms of our rents and some of our IT consulting costs. But if you can't provide the same services for less money, then we need to look at reducing services. That might be quality, that might be quantity. We might be really cannibalizing some of our centralized services, which takes things longer. And then obviously there's the looking at the other side of the balance sheet, enhancing revenues. Do we sell or monetize assets? Do we change our tax or fees? Do we borrow in the short term, in the long term? And obviously, again, we're doing bits of all of this already. But unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. There is no one of these that is the perfect solution that is without consequence. So there's challenges. As I already mentioned, reducing reserves, we're basically out of those. What we really need to do is also make sure that as we're planning for our recovery, that we're planning to build those back up again, because we know something else will hit us in the future and we need to be prepared. If we're going to shift to other sources to fund our things, we'd need willing partners. And it also then will divert funds that would have been used elsewhere. We've seen really great partnership from local philanthropies, the private sectors. We've all tried to pitch in and do what we can right now. We want to see more of that, but obviously there are challenges. Kicking the can, we still have to balance the 5-year plan, so we have to be mindful of that. It can add costs. When we do the debt refinancing this year, yes, we'll save money in the short term, but with the interest cost us more over time. If we're waiting to do technology replacements, we are always at risk at having things break and not being able to deliver services. If we get out of certain businesses, there can be a loss of control over the service quality, quantity, or access. Find efficiencies. There's a point where your options are limited to do that without impacting service quality or quantity. And we're also constrained by a number of laws in our contracts. So we can't just do whatever we want there. We have, some limits on our flexibility. Reducing services is really challenging, particularly, when our vulnerable communities, need us most, and back office cuts can impact staff and service delivery as well. And enhancing the revenues, our state constitution, its uniformity clause basically means that it's really hard to target any revenue enhancements we do to folks with the ability to pay. And so really limits our ability to do progressivity. There's then equity impacts of those increases if we can't do those sort of graduated increases that we want. And we might stifle the economic recovery. What we really want is, when public health considerations allow to come roaring back. But if the way we've gotten ourselves out of this is to increase the burden, that could really hamper that. As I mentioned, we really we are limited by our fixed and inflexible costs, so we don't have much room to maneuver. Our fixed costs are things we can't do anything about right now to change the spending level in the short term, things like our debt service and our pension. But we also have a number of inflexible costs where we have limited room for change, or it would require significant operational and spending changes elsewhere in the budget. For example, you can't just magically say, let's spend 25% less on city benefits. Well, unless, we've really renegotiated all of our contracts or dramatically reduced the size of our workforce, we don't have much room there. So really the discretionary part of our general fund is less than half at 47%. So where do we go from here with all of that great news that I've just shared? First, we're going to continue to update and refine our revenue estimates. We're working with the city's economists and others. We are really thankful to PICA for convening a group of economists at the Federal Reserve next month. So as we get closer to getting the estimates that we'll use for the upcoming budget and 5-year plan, that creates an opportunity for folks and experts to weigh in and sort of kick the tires on those. We're obviously continuing to lobby for federal relief. Really appreciate, sort of the support and collaboration of many council members, to amplify that message. And what we really need is a lot of money. We need it to be flexible, and we need it to come directly to the city. As I mentioned, we're going through a process of getting input. So we are doing those focus groups, a survey. We're also participating in various technical assistance programs and cohorts with other cities so that we can learn from each other, sort of steal each other's best ideas and not repeat each other's mistakes as we try and navigate this. And we're continuing to update our service costs and our priorities, again, using that racial equity lens. And so as we move forward, we'll be heading towards introducing the FY22 budget on April 15th. And obviously the next fiscal year will start in July. So that is what we wanted to share with you, our performance and where we are through the second quarter, as well as our look ahead to FY22. And we are all here and happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. I have several questions, but I'm going to ask on my questions if you can make the responses as concise and specific as possible so we can get to everybody. I also want to recognize Councilmember Curtis Jones for joining us. Good morning, Councilmember Jones. And that general question, maybe for Rob and Marissa. A lot of this is dependent on assumptions of, when certain parts of the economy come back. Can you give us any idea of the assumptions and what you've utilized in these projections?
Sure. So we work with a global econometrics firm called IHS Markit. And what they do is first they, as a company, tend to update their national, international models, and then they refine them down to regional, state, and then county level for us. They don't necessarily build in like, hey, the economy is going to return to normal on, September 23rd, 2021. And so more what they're looking for is sort of quarter over quarter improvement and expansion. Right now, their model does include some level of relief generally being passed in March, and that's impact on the economy. It doesn't factor in a specific amount for Philadelphia's budget, but just generally. So that's some of the assumptions that it currently relies on, that there will be additional relief this spring and that things will improve from there, but it doesn't have a specific date, more incremental improvement.
I say this because I think right now, everything we do in the city connects. Number one, this is all because of the pandemic. So the vaccinations and the plan for vaccinations for the city are crucial. I was watching yesterday on the news, area outside of Boston at Gillette Stadium. They have a plan to do vaccinations of 1 million a month. And I'm just, we've been pushing pretty hard on the vaccination plan because the quicker we get our population vaccinated, the better it is to save lives and bring the economy back. That's the big picture here. And so we're going to look for those plans, but that should be part of it. Everyone in government should be pushing for getting 100,000 people a week vaccinated with every site we can do, because that's really the key to this. So let me go to a few specific questions so we can come back to this. This question is for Harvey Rice. It sounds like, Harvey, we're heading into a $450 million budget gap. And I'm curious as to what PICA thinks are the areas of the general fund budget that you would suggest the city prioritize to improve services and reduce our expenses.
Well, we believe that's up to the city administration and city council to develop their priorities for government spending. And what we do is, when that plan comes to us and that budget, we review and analyze it to make sure that it's reasonable, appropriate, and the budget is balanced. One of the concerns we have, while it won't solve the potential 450 million, is this rising cost in overtime, year after year after year. We have seen overtime increase even during the pandemic, when we thought it might drop down, or decrease, because more employees were working from home. Coupling that with the pandemic and overtime in certain areas to deal with the pandemic. So that has been a concern of PICA and especially the board these past few years. So that would be our one recommendation. But then also to go through their budget, make sure that first they do away with unnecessary spending, and then they're going to have to make some choices to prioritize what delivery of city services are the most paramount to the citizens of Philadelphia, and then present a budget to city council. Whereas then city council will have their hearings, and will then also be able to impact that budget. That budget will be adopted in June and then put into the plan, which will be submitted to PICA sometime after that. And then we will make sure that that budget is reasonable, appropriate, it's balanced for the full 5 years. And hopefully at that, we also know at that point what federal aid will be coming under the President Biden stimulus, which will then also impact that potential $450 million deficit.
Which of the expenses, by the way, do you think are unnecessary?
Well, I hate to beat a dead horse, but overtime, we think some overtime has been unnecessary. We see staffing, leave usage, not a significant problem, but overtime is still rising in certain departments. So that would be one. Then I think it's the city needs to go through as they're doing. They're doing instead of cutting, say, overtime across the board, they're going through every budget to see where spending on overtime can be decreased. And I believe that they're also looking at every department's budget to see what spending may be curtailed for a year or two or curtailed indefinitely. And they will present that to us, and then we'll go through that. We'll review that and monitor it, and to see whether it's appropriate.
Okay. Another question for you. There's been some rumors, we don't know if it's true or not, that the federal government may come through with almost $1.3 billion. We're not sure, but that's the rumor. And in PICA's opinion, how do you think that money should be used? What kind of time frame? Should all of it be used on services? Should we allocate a portion of it for investing in our tax structure to help the existing businesses come back and bring new ones to the city? What's your overview of that?
Well, first of all, Councilman, I agree. It is a rumor. We really don't know. We're here in PICA, we have not put a dollar amount of what the city would receive. But whatever they receive, I think that they have the city should look at it comprehensively, a full approach. One is that to deliver, so they can continue to deliver the services, so they don't have to cut services that the citizens of the city need, and but also look at how we can get, because we got to look to the future. They should be looking to the future, how we can use that money, whether it's for small businesses or other revenue that we would have revenue enhancements coming into the city in the subsequent years.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have a point of information.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to correct the record. I believe both you and Mr. Rice said that the $1.1 billion is a rumor. I would not characterize it as a rumor. I would state that we cannot confirm that based on the community development block grant formula that we will receive $1.1 billion, but it has been passed out of the House Budget Committee and out of the House as a whole and before the Senate. So it may change, and I agree with the sentiments of you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Rice, that it may change if it does get passed, but I would just correct the record to say it's not a rumor and it has been passed out of the House.
This question is for the administration. When discussing the fiscal 22 budget, you mentioned the increasing insurance costs and continuing funding pandemic-related initiatives. They're going to drive our expenditures up, I think, to $5.1 billion, close to $200 million. Can you give us the detail of what that $200 million increase is?
Sure, we can I think an echo, but yeah, we can certainly get back to you, and obviously that'll be within our FY22 budget proposal. There'll be certain areas where you can see, but there's some costs related to pension allocations among the funds, insurance costs, unfortunately, and other things as well. But some of them are things where, we're going to have to spend more, but it's nobody's going to be able to see, touch, feel, or benefit from sort of enhanced service. And we'll be able to provide more information of that. We'll see what we can do in advance, but obviously in the FY22 budget, we'll be highlighting those.
I know you mentioned insurance costs. I'm just trying to get an idea. What do you think the number is for the insurance cost increase?
We can't give you an exact number. We can tell you why it's increasing. So if you look at things like the increase in weather events around the world, that means that insurance companies are more concerned about what their costs are going to be, and they pass on those costs to all of people who pay insurance. And so that's a hit for us. So it's not actually really, in that case, something specific to us. That's kind of a global phenomenon that we're just suffering from.
What is our annual insurance cost right now?
We'll have to get back to you on it. I don't have it in my head. I have it on paper, but we'll get back to you on that.
Okay. There's a question for Harvey Rice. What did PICA think about the overtime report and action plans submitted by the city? And did you get action plans from all requested departments?
We did not receive action plans from all requested departments. I think the only one outstanding is fire. The board would like, and we're attempting to schedule this meeting. However, we're still minus a board member, which hasn't been appointed or appointed yet. So we're going to have an informational meeting with the city, and in regards to the action plans that they submitted, and to get some better clarification of an explanation for these plans in the next month or so.
Wasn't fire on your report the highest number in overtime?
Yes, they have the highest number of overtime. And then if you look at, for the first 2 quarters, the number of fire structures, it's down 20% from last year. Okay. They don't report the EMS calls, so we don't have those numbers. We're going to follow up on those to see if maybe that overtime is shifted to EMS service calls.
I'm going to go to my colleagues, and I'll come back for some more questions. I'd like to recognize Councilmember Maria Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all of the members. I have a couple of tax questions for Harvey and then some operational questions for the administration. When you looked at our tax revenues, you spoke a little bit around BERT and the difficulty in projections. Which is more volatile? Is it the gross or the net profit? And is there anything you're seeing in there that we should be aware of?
I would say the gross in the BERT is more volatile than the net profits. Marissa disagrees with me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so.
I would say that usually the net, because there's more sort of timing or different tax decisions that folks can take, whether to, have have higher expenses. I think historically the gross portion, which is only unfortunately 25%, has been steadier because it's just based on sales. It tends to be fairly similar to our sales tax. But the net income is usually more volatile because, profits can fluctuate and additionally tax planning can take place. We saw when the TCJA, the Trump administration's federal tax changes went in, businesses changed their behavior in anticipation of that because they were expecting lower tax rates. So federal tax policy changes can really impact our net income numbers, and so that does tend to wiggle a bit more.
So
I would the reason why, Councilwoman, the reason why I said Burt was it's a bigger pool where the net profits is around 30 million, and
so I think there's a little confusion in terminology. So okay. I think what Marissa's doing is breaking out the Burt between the net income portion and the gross receipts portion, and saying the net income portion is more volatile.
So have we seen, and if at all, any increase in all those essential businesses that stayed open, particularly the multinationals and their contributions to it, since they were allowed to be open during the COVID relief? What of the COVID business closures and then the essential businesses, what on the gross receipt side, what did we see?
So we unfortunately haven't been able to see anything yet because the 2020 tax returns aren't due yet. So it is too early. We can sometimes use some of our other taxes as canaries in the coal mine to tell us the ones that we collect on a more frequent basis. And obviously the wage tax is our largest tax revenue stream, and that one we do collect frequently. And so that we're breaking out industry by industry. In terms of the wage tax, our largest sectors are actually government and health and human services, and those have stayed pretty sturdy, which is, good for our wage tax collections for the most part. Where we see weakness is in some of the other, hospitality, bars, restaurants, entertainment. Those are ones where year over year, wage tax collections are, still really down. And so that may give us an early indicator about what collections will look like for the Burt from those industries, but it's not always a perfect lockstep relationship between them. So what we can do is, it sounds like you're particularly interested in some of the larger retailers. We could take a look at their wage tax and see if that is, how that's looking so far this year and whether or not that may have somewhat of a precursor of what the Burt looks like.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. Harvey, one of the things that I appreciate, PICA with all of its focus around some of this overtime, and, we're really looking for the structural changes around how we better manage the overtime. I had a question about how PICA looked at the city's overall expenditure, particularly in its contracting, in its capital budget in comparison to other markets. Has the board had any time to say what we're doing, the service delivery models, contracting that we're doing is in line with other jurisdictions that are similar to us, or it's not? Have you had an opportunity to look at that?
We have not had an opportunity to look at that, but that's an interesting idea. I think we'll take that on.
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up along with the chair of fiscal stability and our finance chair to really drill down on what is the cost of doing business and how are we comparing with other jurisdictions. There's some preliminary numbers that when you look at, labor rate numbers in comparison to other markets, we are not in line with the markets like DC and New York. What has happened over the last 5 years and how that increases our infrastructure investments, because every time we have to make tough decisions, the decisions are always around, we have to defer maintenance. And in addition to it adding long-term costs, one would argue that part of why we're paying premiums is because of that, right? People know. And so when we make a decision to make an infrastructure investment, we're at the dear end, right? And so then the market, have we overinflated our market because of our practices around deferred maintenance and infrastructure investment? So I'd be interested in us looking at that, drilling down on that as we plan our 5-year plan. and because the federal government is really speaking to infrastructure investments, how we do this long-term, roads, we're talking schools, and it should, if we're going to do that, we should be looking at our processes around that. And then lastly, the wage tax, I know some of my colleagues will have a discussion and we'll have to continue to drill down on that. Harvey, what is the board considered around what the new normal under COVID government? What are some of the additional 1, 2, 3 outside of overtime things that the board has been looking at that we should be aware of that they have some concerns over?
Well, I think City Council as well as the administration has this concern is when is the non-resident wage tax. What will occur once COVID-19 is behind us, and what will the businesses and the employees in Philadelphia look like? Because not only does it affect the wage taxes that they submit to the city and their businesses collect, but it also has a domino effect on the life of the city and the supporting businesses that support those workers during the day. So that is a concern of ours. It's very difficult, I think, for all of us to project what that impact will be because this is new territory. But it is one of the top issues that we're really looking at and trying to get an understanding going into the future of what life in the city will be like and how that will impact the wage tax, both resident and non-resident. So that would be a significant. And I think another area that we would hope when the city presents their budget and 5-year plan, that because of COVID, what have we learned from it? Are there any efficiencies in government or departments that we've seen over this past year and sometime going forward that we can use as a positive impact in streamlining city government without impacting the delivery of city services?
Thank you. And finally, Marissa, to that point, can you speak to, as you're preparing for the presentation of the budget, what are the 1, 2, 3 guiding principles using your equity lens that you're asking departments to look at, right? If we want to step away from 10% cut across the board, what are the guiding principles, in lieu of a zero-based budgeting or whatever, that you're asking departments to look at? Because I do think that the world has changed and this COVID reality is going to be real different. What is your expectation, especially front-facing departments who now have to change their models?
You're
muted, Marissa.
Sorry, thank you. So part of the way that we've been doing this is really asking departments to, when they're proposing new money or they're proposing one of the cut scenarios, we ask a lot of questions. One, we want to get to the impacts or the outcomes for the service population, and that really impacts the frontline folks. And so we ask questions around, what is it going to worsen or improve racial disparities? And if so, how do they know? Is this anecdotal or something with no data versus which ones can they show us are data-driven, evidence-based changes or, expectations? And so we try and factor that in. We're also asking departments about how they developed these. What was the internal process like, and was that diverse? Also, was there outside impact or collaboration? And we do worry about the front facing, but we also are thinking a lot about what does the impact mean for our workforce. We had gotten some feedback that in the FY21 version 2 of the budget, that it was sort of clear you could see some of the decisions we made and sort of thinking about the impacts on communities but we maybe didn't do as good a job thinking about the impacts on our city workforce who would be impacted by layoffs as much as we could. And obviously we have constraints because of the union contracts and because of civil service regulations, but we do want to consider both the public impacts as well as the impacts on our workforce and who's impacted. And as we go into the FY22 budget, we're intent. I'll tell you now, I don't even think I've told Rob this yet. There's going to be a new chapter on how we're using racial equity in our decision making in the 5-year plan to really flesh that out a bit.
Yeah, it'll be council's expectation that you can share that framework and on a department by department basis. I think it's very important that we have that document and a framework so that as we're measuring the choices that we have to make moving forward, because I do think this is also an opportunity to realign certain things that we were doing that maybe we shouldn't be in the business of doing. And I was very encouraged when you spoke about what does government do well, and then where could we be better partners with our community stakeholders because they do it better, and having that honest conversation and and understanding the tension points. I know that we have some departments that are very program driven, where we have program stakeholders in the community that could do the work probably more efficiently and more effectively. So I'm going to be looking at that space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. I also want to make sure I recognize Council Member Bass and Council Member Thomas. And now I'd like to go to Council Member Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just have a few quick questions. Looking at some of the options that I believe, Marissa, you provided in your testimony to deal with the upcoming budget, has there been any discussions about early retirements as a way of reducing the workforce, as a way of reducing expenditures?
Yeah, we had some discussions, and there was legislation introduced last week for the airport facing their own real significant challenges to move forward with an early retirement plan. So we're doing it there. For the departments in the general fund, we talked to commissioners. They were really concerned about what that would mean operationally. So we wound up not going with it for general fund departments. We are proposing one for the airport.
And I understand the concerns in operations, but still this could be an option to possibly reduce expenditures, considering that we're looking at a $450 million budget deficit.
Yep, and I'd say it was an option we looked at, and department studied it really hard and came to the conclusion that looking at the employees they were worried they would lose through an early retirement plan, that it was a risk they didn't want to take.
Okay, we'll revisit that at some point later. Some other quick questions. Marissa, in your presentation, you talked about performance measures and you talked about homeless prevention and that the city met its measures. I'm curious how the city met its measures, considering that throughout most of the pandemic, we've had some significant homeless issues, both at the airport and more recently at SEPTA. I had a chance to tour the SEPTA stations along with council members Squilla and Gim and Gilmore Richardson on Friday. And this is going to be a very significant issue and impact not only for the operations of SEPTA, operations at the airport, but also have an impact in reference to both hospitality and also other measures that will impact possibly our revenue as we move forward as a city. So can you give some perspective on what steps we're taking? How did we meet those performance measures that you said were on target?
Sure, and I apologize, I misspoke because I was talking about one specific measure that was highlighted there in terms of there's a particular assistance program where they provide dollars to prevent homelessness folks who need sort of emergency stopgap filling so that they don't become homeless, and that was the program I was referencing. What I can do is go back and look at the whole suite of Office of Homeless Services measures and get back to the chair on which ones are on track, which are off track, and particularly any gaps. One of the things we do with the program-based budgeting and the performance measures is that we are somewhat regularly updating those to make sure that we're collecting over 500, but that still just sort of nibbles at the whole breadth of what we do as a city. So we can come back to you and see if there are any gaps to make sure that if we're not measuring where the concerns are, is there anything we need to update there? And obviously there's going to be some new measures this year. Just across the budget, for example, in the Department of Public Health, they've got a new unit, COVID containment, affectionately known as COCO, and that's a program that's now going to need its own measures. So it's not unusual. We actually work through that process with PICA when we're looking at, do we have the right measures in place? And so I'll get back to you with the whole breadth of the Office of Homeless Services ones, and really interested in any feedback if you think there are gaps in terms of what we're capturing. And obviously I hear the larger issue of how are we going to address the actual problems that are clearly visible, and be able to do that. Because as the one thing I mentioned earlier in this is that, in FY21, we had received fairly significant federal grants through the Emergency Solutions Grant for Homeless Services that had allowed us to reduce our footprint in terms of general fund dollars. But I think it is a real question that if those grants aren't recurring, how exactly are we going to navigate that?
Yeah, the issue is not just those that have, unfortunately, not a place to stay, but also the substance abuse population as well. That's kind of merged together. That has created some real challenges for our city. And I think it's something that we're going to have to address from a intergovernmental approach and a public-private partnership approach, not only with the city, but city council, the Chamber of Commerce, and other entities, to really try to put together some real strategies to address some of these issues going forward. You talked about using a racial equity lens. I've heard that phrase used quite a bit throughout the administration, and you're going to be working with Office of Economic Opportunity in that regard. So how will that occur in reference to the city's spend of dollars from a procurement perspective? To the extent that I've seen through my experience in city government, we don't always have OEO at the table for various departments when they're making procurement allocations and the spending decisions. And so often it's kind of an afterthought to some degree in reference to really making those hard decisions of how we spend city dollars in a way that's going to really enhance the city of Philadelphia, especially our local-based businesses. So how will that occur in this upcoming budget?
So I'm really glad you asked that, because that is one of the key changes we made this year to our internal process. So normally in the past, departments, when they come in with their proposals for the upcoming fiscal year, they would meet with the budget office, and they would have a separate set of meetings with OEO, and you referenced that it maybe could feel like an afterthought. This year, we had OEO and procurement as part of that budget meeting with the procurement commissioner, as well as Iola Harper from running the OEO office, who was embedded in that budget meeting, so that those are no longer separate conversations. That is one single conversation. If we're talking about your budget, we're talking about your OEO participation goals in the same meeting. So that's one of the changes we've made this year, so that we could really push and ask questions as we're talking about people's 200 or class 300 or 400 budgets. What was there? And so that's one of those areas where we are trying to better integrate those budget conversations with the participation goals so that we can push that forward. And so that's one example of how we're doing that. Another example of applying a racial equity lens. This is from the capital budget, and I'm not sure exactly how we'll depict this, but we get lots and lots of requests for funding in. And so in certain areas, what we say had the Commerce Department do for economic development projects was we plotted in a matrix, impact on economic development on one axis and impact on racial disparities in the other. And really, we are looking for the projects that have the highest impact on economic development simultaneously with the highest impact on reducing racial disparities. Now, there are a lot of limitations in what we're doing. We spend a lot of time, trying to learn from other cities and see where they are and what they're doing. But it's still really subjective, and there's a lot of practices, but we don't yet have evidence-based, data-driven sort of information to tell us, how to score this investment in homeless services against this investment in anti-violence, about which is going to do more to reduce disparities. So we acknowledge there are a lot of limitations in how we're doing this work, but we are trying to learn from our peers. We're trying to look internally and surface as many different ways as possible to make sure that when we're talking about how we're spending money, that is, central to the conversation.
Well, that's definitely a positive step going forward in that regard. So now OEO will have a better perspective throughout the year what various departments are going to be spending as the budgets are being put together. But it's also important that as those departments are going through those procurement steps, OEO is right there at the table during the whole process. And that has not always been the case. I'm glad they have the information out up front and not at the back end. But now that they have information regarding the various departments, it's important that OEO is there at the beginning of the procurement process for these specialist Class 200 and other type of contracts, so that way we can make sure there's true participation and dollars spent at the local level. Just wanted to close with two other quick questions. Generally, what is the cost on our city resources for an average snowstorm in the city?
So that really varies by storm.
I figured, but still, generally, what's the range? I'm not saying it's X amount of dollars, but what's the general range? What has historically been?
So that, and Marissa can jump in, that first big storm this year by itself, I think, Marissa, that came in around 5 million. But then some of the other storms were much smaller cost, like in the hundreds of thousands. But a really big storm can cost millions of dollars. We were fortunate in that we really went years without seeing that kind of storm. So we, in general, put in a contingency in the budget for those storms. For years, that was great. And the cost of the storms was coming in much, much lower than our contingency. This year, obviously, it went the other way.
And then last question, and I know Mr. Chair and Mr. Rice both made reference to President Biden's American Rescue Plan. That has not been passed. We can't guarantee that it will pass, considering we've been in this place in the past in reference to aid to local governments. Last year, the CARES plan included aid to local governments, and then last minute that was replaced with additional direct dollars to individuals around the nation. So that matter has not been settled. However, the administration did push back the budget address from its historical time to April 15th. One would venture that was done to see what would happen at the federal level. So if there is additional dollars that comes from direct aid to the city of Philadelphia under the American Rescue Plan, what will be the timeline to incorporate those dollars, and will that be reflected in the April 15th budget, or will there be a revision to the budget in that regard?
So we are hoping that it's passed in time for us to include it in the April 15th budget. And you're right, that was the reason that we pushed back the budget. One, to see what happened with that package, and then two, to see what happened with our own revenues. I know that the goal is to get it passed by mid-March so that it's timed with when unemployment benefits expire. As you have been doing, we've been looking at the various analyses by groups of what it would mean for us. So we hope that we'll be in pretty good shape if it's passed within the next few weeks and doesn't change radically at the end, that we'll be able to include it in the budget. I do also want to say, some of the pushback has been that jurisdictions don't really need this money because their budgets have been coming in better than anticipated. That's not the position we're in. We desperately need every penny we can get to make sure that our budget and our 5-year plan stays balanced. So we are hoping that the bill passes in the form that it looks like now, with discretionary money that will help us keep our budget and plan balanced.
So if it is passed by the timeline that I've heard, and I think you also referenced, there's a good possibility that you'll be able to include it in the April 15th budget.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. Also, I just want to recognize that Councilman O was present for the hearing, and I'd like to call upon Councilmember Gim for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I had a couple of questions. So could you explain what is the actual amount of money we give in grant money to the school district last year?
Last year, if you have it.
For FY21, the current year, it's $252 million.
252. Okay. And that was
earlier year.
Was that an increase from the previous year?
Yes.
It was. Last year was 227.
227. Okay. And has the district, we did not have our IGA. We were supposed to have it last week, but we did not have our quarterly update with the district yet. But have you gotten indication about the decision not to assess property taxes and whether you anticipate a request to increase the grant amount to the district this year, or whether you think that will hold flat?
In FY22, you mean?
Yes.
So we had built in escalating contributions through the 5-year plan, including an increase for next year. We have not had any discussions yet about what will happen with that request, but we assume that the district will give us a request that's consistent with the 5-year plan.
And the 5-year plan puts us at FY22 for what amount?
269 million.
269.
And clearly, if the governor's budget were to go through, and the request in particular from state around the education spending, have you done any projections around the impact of the governor's budget on school district finances and whether that would impact anything in terms of the city?
Yeah, so I think both the governor's budget and the federal relief both would have impacts on the district's finances, and I think both would push back the year when the district is projecting that it will have deficits. So they both would have really positive impact on the district's finances.
Right. And it seems that the district feels more positive about the federal relief, and it continues like the state legislature work is always going to be in play until the end. Is that accurate?
That's definitely accurate. And as we talked about with Councilmember Green, our hope is that we'll know what's happening with the federal relief by the time we do our budget. I don't think that'll be, as you're saying, I don't think that'll be the case with the state budget.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess my question on overtime might be for both PICA and the city. Last year, the city made a promise about curtailing overtime. Obviously, I think for multiple reasons, there was indication of what was problematic about all of that, including the fact that many members of our city forces were sick as a result of COVID. Others were therefore called upon to do overtime. It was pretty traumatizing and difficult. And, I'm sure all of us on city council want to express our gratitude to our city workers around this. As we head into the next year, however, I think one of the questions I have for both PICA and the city are, doing a blanket statement about overtime, doing blanket statements at this point do not seem particularly helpful nor strategic, in part because it's obvious that in general, overtime is problematic. But there's no question that we should have learned a few things, and particularly about certain departments, why overtime was incurred. And as we move into budget projections for next year, is PICA taking a more strategic approach to recommendations on overtime, and then also looking at particular departments and areas where, for example, the fire department had significant amounts of overtime, but our answer isn't obviously to say, hey, you know, we're not going to fill those positions because obviously people's lives are in danger. But are you taking a more strategic look at overtime rather than just kind of a blanket look at a set of numbers on a spreadsheet? And I'll go to PICA first, and then I'd like to hear from the city and Rob and Marissa how you're thinking about it.
We are in this manner looking at strategically. When we met with the city regarding the overtime and the action plans, we worked with them on the departments we really wanted to see where we thought it was necessary to do action plans, to put forward them, to, and I think the city and PICA came to an agreement with all the departments that submitted the action plan. So while we report sometimes the overall number, we also in our reports look at every department, and we are concerned about those departments that keep on increasing, and we're trying to determine why they're increasing, especially when we started looking at this about 4 or 5 years ago. The answer was, well, our staffing levels were low. We're not up to full contingent of staffing. Well, now our staffing levels have surpassed, probably been at their highest until the pandemic. So, and then overtime was also their highest. So that argument started to raise questions of, that argument actually isn't working. So we do look at it strategically. We look at those departments that consistently have an increase in overtime, even though their staffing levels have increased. So, so in working with the city, we both came to an agreement on the identification of those departments that we think we could, if they did a thorough review of where their overtime is, where they can cut overtime, then overall overtime could be reduced in the annual budget.
Thank you. Thank you, Harvey. And so thank you, council member, because I really appreciate the way you framed that question. And so, yes, we're not looking at it as one sort of behemoth of a cost center, but looking at it department by department and really understanding the drivers that really vary, because really overtime is a tool to deliver services. Sometimes it is the most effective, most efficient. And in those cases, we've been very clear, we don't want to reduce our reliance because that's the best way to deliver a service. In other areas, we've seen that there are other interventions. And those really, it may be that maybe we don't need to provide that service or provide it at a lesser quality or quantity. In other cases, we might want to leverage technology to provide that service differently. But sometimes that requires a heavy upfront investment that we might not have. And so we provided department by department. And I think, and as Harvey mentioned, the one that's outstanding still is fire, because that is one where their entire operation is built on structural overtime. It's not one event or one thing, but literally doing the job that they do right now is dependent entirely on that. And we have learned, I will say, doing this analysis during a pandemic, odd time to do it. Things are not normal. Operations are not normal. Service needs are not normal. Our staff's ability to be present, not normal. But we did still see things. One of the things we looked when we dug deeper is the role that special events play in driving overtime. Some of our smaller departments, so not talking big dollars, but special events or unplanned events, both happy and tragic, are not things that individual departments tend to budget in and have as part of their core mission, but are things that have historically been thrust upon them. And so PICA asked us to do actually two things. One, just get better in our budgeting, so that we were more impactful, because a lot of departments, they may have exceeded their overtime spending, but not their overall class 100. So they're still managing within their budget for personnel costs, but just doing it different ways. So how can we better refine our forecasting so that the budgets put forth within that same number still have the right allocation for straight time versus that. Because we talked to some departments where, it just wouldn't make sense, that it would cost more to bring more staff on, because maybe there's 10 different people, each with specialized expertise, that need to do a little bit of overtime, that you couldn't hire one more person to do all that breadth of work, plus there would be extra costs for benefits, that it really makes sense. There's other areas, though, that we saw that there were real opportunities to dial back. One of the, as we dug into this, one of the things we learned was a recent technology investment at LNI in Eclipse helped them have their inspectors spend a lot less time doing scheduling, because now folks who want to schedule an appointment can do self-service scheduling that lets them do, focus their time on actually doing the inspections. And so, the caseloads being what they were able to do less overtime. So we really are trying to think of this, one, that overtime in and of itself isn't good or bad. It's a tool to deliver services. Sometimes it's the right one, sometimes it's not. And we're taking that department by department approach. And so I think actually growing out of the appropriations hearing and a question from Councilmember Thomas, we'll send over to Council the individual departmental action plans that address what are the drivers and then what is the response. In some cases, departments said this is the best way, we want to do it. And we agreed that we still want this service and this is the best way. In other cases, they've identified ways to change it. As I mentioned, though, fire still, because that is their entire operation, is continuing to take a lot of internal discussion. That one requires that real thoughtful look. We can't just sort of make that on the fly.
Right. And look, like I understand how complicated this area is. I think in the issue of a certain department, obviously like fire is a good example of this. I think it's one thing when overtime is within the boundaries. It's another thing when the overtime allocations become multiples of a department's budget, which was actually what we were seeing. And so I think it's just a better, thoughtful thing. Now, I guess, I'm going to leave this as a comment and not as a question. But one of the things that I do hope that we are getting, or that you are getting, is clear direction from city about what departments really do need to be prioritized. Looking at the list of the 12 departments, and especially looking in retrospect, there should have been, or should continue to be, ongoing review of departments that really do need to see a dramatic amount of expansion. And this is also for PICA. PICA has to understand that this city was in massive crisis, that there were areas of work that had to expand. For example, like outreach, mental health work, emergency situations, that required and demanded services. There's no question to me that seeing DHS significantly increase is not a surprise, given the amount of need and the work that went in, from food delivery to supports and outreach and door-to-door management of services under multiple departments, that should have been one of the departments that would have seen an increase, and that we should be fine with that. There are other areas where you might ask questions, like I'm not sure why First District Court would have seen, I think they actually saw a decline, is that right? So 42% decline. The slides move pretty quickly, and I don't have the slide right in front of me. But again, it's one of the areas where you would want to see, like, if certain departments were more muted during this time period, it might make more sense. My hope is that finance is getting clear direction from the city of Philadelphia. And I know for myself and for council members on here, we do want to see expansion in some areas, just period. Like, there just needs to be help. And so I hope that that's something that's taken into play. I think my colleague, Councilmember Green, spoke very eloquently about the importance of support for SEPTA. We believe that SEPTA is going to be a critical factor in the city's ability to engage our region, to bring commerce back to life, to bring business centers and economic corridors back to life. We are deeply concerned about SEPTA's ability to manage the multiple crises that are being kind of compiled on, especially when you have a decrease in ridership and a more isolated kind of transportation corridor that's going on right now. But we're not going to be able to improve that if the actual experience of riding SEPTA feels unsafe, unclean, and unhealthy for people. So, there needs to be ongoing discussion. We know that the SEPTA board made a conscious decision about using some of its federal CARES Act money, for example, on maintaining its infrastructure pipeline. And maybe as we're dealing with emergencies within the city, we want to continue to have that conversation. Either way, though, it feels very important to us that is a collective dialogue. You don't control SEPTA's budget. They are quasi-independent, but our city does depend on it as much as it does on the school district. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I guess the last question I just wanted to clarify for Rob, because I didn't quite understand the response to Councilman Green. So I think he was asking about the potential offer for early retirement. This goes back a little bit to my earlier question about taking a look at departments on a strategic level. I don't actually know whether there are union guidelines around early retirement, whether it has to be applied across the board or whether departments can kind of be encouraged to take can be offered early retirement as opposed to an across the board, city worker kind of offer. But I guess I wasn't clear what your answer was. It sounded like it was considered for early retirement on kind of a blanket level. It was declined, but I was wondering if you could just clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, it was actually we went out to every cabinet member. And they went down to all their departments, talked through whether they wanted to participate in an early retirement program. And departments did not want to participate because they were really concerned about the senior level employees that they would lose and what that would mean for their operations.
Yeah. It's understood. I agree with my council member, though, that as we look at a devastating potential impact on our budget, having departments plan out, there's a 5-year plan in place, right? And I clearly think that COVID upends some of the 5-year planning so that some departments may be needing expansion and a real robust investment right now, especially as we focus in on recovery, focus in on health, and focus in on addressing longstanding racial disparities. Other departments may need to be on a 5-year trajectory where it's maybe the growth is more muted. And I'm wondering if you are having, again, and encourage the city to have, again, that approach, that it needs to be kind of a purposeful direction about priorities for departments.
Yeah, that is definitely a key part of the process this year and really has to be given the challenge that we're facing.
Yeah. My last question is on housing. And with regard to the clear emphasis on priorities for the city. Housing issues were a clear priority for the council body last spring as we headed into COVID and, the past, hellish year of 2020. There was no question that we felt like we were not only on the right footing by emphasizing housing, which got slashed in the mayor's original budget, but got restored. It, in fact, turned out to be one of our most successful programs. I mean, we should underscore the fact that while there are precious few areas where we should, we can say that there were good things. And, Ms. Waxman, I really do appreciate you're talking about L&I and the IT stuff because we need to hear a lot more of those examples of those stories. I also want to score the importance of housing. We were first out the gate on the eviction moratorium. We had already had in place an investment in PHL Rent Assist, which, the budget preserved with right to counsel, landlord-tenant court, lawyer for a day programs and advice for people, especially as they were dealing with unlicensed landlords, potentially illegal evictions that were kind of off the books as we sought to protect people. Those things all came into play. But more importantly, I think what the investment in housing did was that it drew down additional money. Philadelphia moved over $60 million in rent vouchers out to communities and families. The city put in 10. Council put in 8 because we were so quick, because our folks at the city level were paying attention to the programs. They were nimble and they already had the vehicle to do something. But our $18 million investment on our end translated into $60 million, and now there's over $100 million potentially coming to us from the state level. My hope is that as we plan out for the coming year, that we recognize that there were areas of the city where city agencies and incredibly heroic individuals throughout city government did tremendous work in keeping people housed, keeping people stable, and making sure that landlords were paid. And as a result, we became like an enormous vehicle for moving money efficiently, responsibly, and quickly throughout our city. My hope is that as we go into the coming year, that the housing budget will not be a place again where the city chooses to slash. Because it will be core to our stability. And I ask this also of PICA to keep this in mind, that there are we do need to make sure that we have success stories on the books, priorities that were met. They should match the city's priorities, absolutely. But it's not often that we saw a lot of, well, let me take that back. We saw a lot of local heroes in 2020. And I will underscore the fact that I felt that out of 2020, the housing justice people and city agencies did a yeoman's job. So I will hope that the housing arena and that the city's continued stability around housing will remain a priority, and we don't have to go through what we went through in the last budget cycle. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council Member. I'd like to call Councilmember Kathy Gilmore-Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this hearing, and thank you to the PICA board, Rob and Marissa, for all of your work. I wanted to start by echoing the sentiments of my colleagues, Council Members Green and Gim, around our need to ensure that we're supporting SEPTA as a part of our region's overall recovery. We had an opportunity last week to ride the subway on the East Market side with Council Members Gim, Squilla, Green, Brooks, and myself. And I will say, as a lifelong Philadelphian, as someone who rode the bus every day to school from Winfield to Center City when I went to Masterman, and also on the subway when I went to Girls High, and then again on the bus routes when I went to college at Westchester, I have never seen conditions worse than what we saw last Friday. So I am imploring all of you, the administration and all of us, to consider intergovernmental briefings with SEPTA on a weekly basis so that we can all work together to ensure that some of the challenges we are seeing around our most vulnerable populations, particularly those who are houseless and also those who are suffering in addiction, can be addressed. As we are trying to push individuals to come back to the city as we move forward in the vaccination process. So I definitely wanted to start there. I wanted to go back to earlier in your presentation, Marissa, where you talked about the GFAO recommended level of reserves, particularly for larger municipal cities, and talk about, because we have a 5-year plan that we have to plan out, how you all are thinking around ensuring that we can increase our reserves moving forward. I know around this time last year, we had a hearing in this committee where we talked about our city's readiness for any potential economic recession. And little did we know, I remember us talking about at the end of that hearing, this thing called the coronavirus that was on the West Coast, and about some articles that we had read in the New York Times. And little did we know the overall impact COVID would continue to have on our city budget. So can you talk about how you all, even in the throes in the midst of this pandemic, are thinking about building up our reserves over time, particularly to get to the GFAO recommended level? Because I think if we were at those levels going into this pandemic and really kind of tightening our budget before the pandemic, that we would have been in a better place and not have just 3 days of discretionary spending. So can you talk about how you all are thinking about increasing our reserves, even while we're in the pandemic.
So certainly that basically the process we're in now as we're developing the FY22 budget and the 5-year plan is very much on the minds, particularly of the finance folks, because and particularly that slide we showed and how we had that reserve. Imagine, if we had been at 29 million at the start of the coronavirus, that would have been hundreds more millions in either cuts or revenue enhancements. And so, we think, within government and externally, that's a message that's getting through. Folks recognize, but we also understand there are real trade-offs there. So, we'll figure out what we can do to build up over the course of the 5-year plan. But, to get to that 17%, the 2 months in the bank, that's 800 million. And we've got real trade-offs there with service delivery, particularly when 53% of our budget is fixed or inflexible. If we had to, carve out, 800 million out of half of our budget, that's huge. That's a huge percentage. And so that's where a lot of our challenges are. And so we'll be talking about that. We also talk to our peers in a lot of cities, and we know how important this is. So I don't want to, we're not at a point yet where we've got our FY26 fund balance percentage target, but certainly that's something we know that we're going to need to build back as we're trying to triangulate between, having a tax structure that helps our economic recovery, providing services that meets the needs of Philadelphians, while at the same time building back up a reserve so that for the next thing we're in a good place. And really that's the challenge we have. And so, it is triangulating between those three sort of opposing needs that'll be forefront in our mind as we go into, producing that 5-year plan. I don't know, Rob, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think it is really important to think about the trade-offs, because there are cities that, if you look at other cities, a lot of them have gotten to that 17% or even higher. And some of them even managed to stay there during this process. And part of their decision-making was whether they dip into those fund balances. It's a lot more complicated for us because we're both a city and a county, which means that we're providing a different array of services from some of the other cities. And because we have a higher poverty level than many of those cities, we also have a different tax base. So Marissa's talking about, the trade-offs between tax base and services. That really plays into some of our decision-making about thinking whether we really will get up to that 17% or whether we want to get, more in the range of the 6 to 8% where we were before. And then that's a discussion we always have. But one thing that we all agree on is 29 million is too low. It doesn't give us enough of a cushion, and we have to build that up over time.
Sure, and I agree with you, and thank you, Rob, for your response. Marissa, you walked right into some of my next questions around our fixed costs. And I know you talked about previously some of our debt and looking to restructure that debt and sort of refinance while rates are historically low. So can you talk about some of the debt restructuring that has happened since the onset of the pandemic and sort of the indicators around the restructuring you were able to accomplish thus far, and what your thinking is about that moving forward? And then my second question, so that you're able to frame your response around where I'm trying to go with this, is how are you all thinking about our tax restructuring overall in the future? I mean, particularly, because we rely so heavily on the wage tax as the largest, portion of our budget. How are you all thinking about, restructuring to move towards what our new normal will look like in the future? Because I do think that's important to, how we figure out, what's next.
So let me take the debt portion, and then I'll flip it over to Marissa for the tax structure portion. So we have, and even before the pandemic hit, one of the constants is that we are looking at all of our outstanding debt and looking at opportunities for refundings. And so, you'll notice through the Finance Committee, there's kind of a constant stream of requests for refundings, not just in our general fund, but in our water fund, our aviation fund. So that's a constant. What's different this time is that we've added in a fairly substantial restructuring of our pension obligation bonds. And so we've done that in a way that would save over $90 million citywide and about $75 million in our general fund. So that is, one of the important parts of our overall plan for how we got through 21. And without that, what was already an ugly process would have been much uglier. So that is the Treasurer's Office, they're meeting with people every day to figure out the best way to look at our outstanding debt and to see opportunities for refundings. We'll say one of the things that happened at the federal level a few years ago was ending the ability to do advance refundings, which took away one of the ways that we have to reduce our costs. There was bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate last week that would bring back advance refundings. That would be a big help for us. That would help us look for other opportunities to save money.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful, and I'll definitely follow up on the advanced refunding portion specifically. I also wanted to talk about contracts as well. I know some of my colleagues mentioned contracts earlier in this conversation, like Councilmember Green and others, but I wanted to specifically zero in on contracts by each department. And if you could submit this information to the chair, that would be most helpful. But if you could provide a list of all contracts for each city department that are held by former city employees. And if you could detail their original hire date, meaning when they were hired by the city originally, their separation date, and their contract award date and amount, and if the contract is yearly and has a approval, sometimes you have the 1 year contract and then you typically would approve it year by year on a year by year basis. So if you could just detail that information and provide that to the chair, that would be most helpful. And finally, I don't know that we'll be able to get a clear response on this, but I wanted to talk about some services that are provided to some of our city departments that typically city employees can do. So I wanted to know if you have a list, or if you could provide a list to the chair of all contracts in each city department that city employees could typically do, and the amount of those contracts. And if we need to talk offline about that, I would be more than happy to do so. But that would be helpful. We can talk more offline about that. But I'm specifically, yeah.
I from looking at Marissa's face, I think neither she and I completely understand what you're asking, so we should definitely have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I'll definitely follow up with that, because I do think it'll be an important conversation to have going into some of the upcoming contract negotiations with the city unions. So thank you very, very much. And I wanted to, again, circle back to the other request around the list of all the contract by former employees. If you could just provide that to the chair, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Council Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Rob and Marissa.
I would just have a quick follow-up question to Councilmember Gilmore Richardson's question regarding the advance refunding. If that legislation does get passed, have we done any kind of a financial analysis as to how much money we could possibly save with that legislation?
So I think what's happened over time is we haven't looked as much at those opportunities because we weren't able to capitalize on them. And that's something we can start to look at now.
If you could let us know, that'd be interesting, because maybe we could help lobby to get that through possibly.
Yep. That would be great. Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Jones, I know you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for pulling this fiscal stability hearing together. I think it's the most important questions we can be asking for our city over the next year. But Rob Emanuel and Winston Churchill before him said, never let a good crisis be wasted, something to that effect. And I was wondering if, in fact, we are going to see some relief measures pass through the Senate. It probably will not include the $15 an hour wage increase, but it will include a lot of interesting reimbursements and also opportunities for the city of Philadelphia. Who is at the heart of the team evaluating where those opportunities might find buckets within the city of Philadelphia?
So we have a recovery committee, recovery office, and Sarah's here from that office, but there's also a steering committee with that group that has representation from around the city, including the mayor's office, commerce, finance, to make sure that we're having kind of ongoing discussions about the best way to access money and the best way to use it. I'm going to let Sarah give more details on that response.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. So I'm Sarah DeWolf, Recovery Officer for the city. And as Rob mentioned, we have a steering committee. We meet monthly right now. We'll probably meet more frequently if additional legislation gets passed. But that steering committee does include diverse and representative members from across city government as well as city council, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we elevate, significant spending decisions up to that steering committee for consideration as a way of getting input and buy-in.
Don't get me wrong. I really appreciate the hashtag diversity and inclusion. I mean, everybody is woke, as they say. I get it. But I want some specifics, as in where would a bucket for criminal justice reform or anti-violence, or more, as importantly, big picture opportunities, such as mass transit enhancements. I believe now is the time to plant a seed for regional light rail. Regional light rail going from Bucks County down to the Wissahickon Transfer Station, down to Center City, to Delaware Avenue, down to the airport. And I say that because it's going to take 10 years for that seed to be planted into a tree that we can harvest fruit from. But if we don't do it now, it may never happen. And in this Joe Biden administration, there's going to be a large infrastructure repair bill. We have 100 plus bridges in Philadelphia that are over 100 years old, that are imminently dangerous. But I want to know that we're teeing up for those kinds of opportunities coming from Washington. And we're coordinating with Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, our state partners, to be able to fast track this relief so that it actually helps us this fiscal year. And so please give me some indication of how that coordination is happening.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you mentioned the next significant piece of legislation that we're expecting to see, which is going to be focused around transportation and infrastructure. And we are beginning to have conversations around that, obviously understanding, not knowing the details of what that legislation might be, but understanding that that is coming our way and we need to be ready for it. So we've been working closely with the mayor's office on that. We've talked with the Chamber of Commerce, and we're also, internally looking, kind of dusting off some of our previous plans and lists of significant infrastructure projects, and really thinking through what does the criteria look like now? Is it the same or is it different? Do we have new layers of criteria that we want to put on these projects in order to identify what would really be the most significant or most important project that we would want to fund?
So, for example, when we had the stimulus program under the Obama administration, I've been around long enough to see us scrambling around for shovel-ready projects to meet the criteria. We have advance notice that this is coming down the pike. We should take this opportunity to say, we really looked at that light rail. We didn't believe we could get funding for it. Just maybe there might be manna from heaven to come down to fix that. Imagine that on top of a Sixers facility on Delaware Ave. That would change our financial projections for the next 10 years. So I'd like us to stop the bleeding, because we're leaking at this moment. But after we finish the triage, we could actually take this crisis to actually start to look to a brighter Philadelphia. And listen, Mr. Chairman, I'm always the glass is half full. I'm that kind of guy. But I don't believe it'll be half full if we don't have a vision for how we can take advantage of this crisis right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman. What you're really talking about is we should probably put together a plan, a bucket list of things we should be doing over the next 5 to 10 years. And the transit plans you're talking about, I think, are great ideas. Great info. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go to Councilmember Isaiah Thomas, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, thank you, Councilmember Jones, too, because that's a perfect segue into my question. So, and of course, thank you to everybody for being here to testify. We had a hearing recently that spoke to the importance of investment, significant investment in infrastructure. In the midst of being here today and listening to all the great testimony as well as questions from my colleagues, I did not hear anything about capital investment as it relates to infrastructure of our streets, our roads, and things like that. In our hearing last week, we found out that 12% of the roads in the city of Philadelphia produce 80% of the car accidents. So I'm wondering, what plans are in place to address this issue when we seen more people die in 2020 from fatalities dealing with car accidents and hit and runs than what we've seen in nearly over a decade. And based on the hearing, we found that the primary sustainable solution is changing the structure of our streets. So I'm wondering what's the plan there and how do we see that fitting into the work that's being done from the fiscal side?
So I will say that paving and those Vision Zero investments and others are part of what will be in the FY22 capital budget. Pre-pandemic, that had clearly been one of our highest priorities. However, there were a number of pressures on obviously our operating and capital budgets, so we obviously couldn't spend as much as we wanted, but those are still clearly in the mix as we develop the FY22. And then there's obviously thinking about the sort of larger, federal infrastructure investments that go beyond sort of the sort of meat and potatoes of our standard year in, year out capital budget. I'm not sure, Sarah, if have any information about that big bill or if that's still in the works about how the city is going to be thinking sort of regionally about those big infrastructure type investments.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of specifics at this point, unfortunately. We have heard indication that a starting point might be a previously introduced infrastructure bill, and apologies, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but I can provide it as follow-up. The other thing that we're hearing is just that there may be a return of earmarks, but again, very little detail around that. So unfortunately, not a lot of information to tell us whether that would cover some of our core infrastructure projects.
So in the hearing, there wasn't a whole lot of detail specifically targeting areas. And I just want to, again, reiterate the importance of focusing on not just the 12% of the roads that produce 80% of the car accidents, but also looking at areas in the city of Philadelphia where the administration actually found the relationship between not just gun violence and poverty, but hit and runs and unreported hit and runs, and the need to pour resources in those communities to essentially address those issues. So I did want to just put that out there first. Real quick, and I'm sorry, Chairman, I don't want to be too long. Just keeping this same streets hat on, are we considering how a Safer Streets grant could be expanded by the coming infrastructure bill? Is that something that's a part of your conversation?
I think on our side, we'd have to get back. I don't know if, Sarah, you have any information off the top of your head, but we can look into that.
Back to you, Tim. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we're just concerned that we have an opportunity right now to be able to address some of the capital investment that we need in infrastructure. We feel like a collaboration with the federal government at this time can put us in a position where it might not cost us as much as the actual total amount. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation and hope that that's something that we can look to do and work together on so that we can assure that we're doing something about the safety issues in our city. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you again, everybody, for allowing me to be here today.
And just to add that the folks from our Transportation Infrastructure Office are actively involved in our discussions about what we should look for in that infrastructure bill. So things like the safety program will be things that, are high on their priority list and that are part of our conversations.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas. All great points. Thanks for your input. I don't believe there's any other questions from my colleagues, but I do have a few remaining questions that I held off asking. So I figured I'd bring them up now. And either Marissa or Rob, you're welcome to take a crack at either one of them.
Just like the lightning round at the end?
This is it. Yeah, this is it. 30 seconds. So, this is regarding that potential relief funding we may get. So the relief funding we get from the federal government will basically probably be a one-time boost to our budget. And the concern is we want to be very careful about using funding from this one-time boost to add on recurring expenses we might not be able to cover in future years when we don't have this relief funding from the federal government. So as you're preparing for that fiscal year 22 budget, I would ask that you provide council with information regarding all one-time funded programs and personnel so we can clearly distinguish between what's going and what has the potential to be lost in future years to offset grant dollars. And the question, I guess, is how is the administration, how are you thinking about balancing the one-time expenditures versus the recurring costs when we apply this relief funding?
Thank you for that question, because that's been a topic of conversation for us, because we're obviously very concerned about the same issue. And we think, kind of looking at the structural problems we face, that we have to be really purposeful and thoughtful about how we deploy whatever federal funding that we get so that it helps us bring about structural solutions to the structural problems we face. And that's how we intend to use it. Obviously, we'll know better how that works when we see what comes out of whatever is finally passed and whatever requirements are around it. But we share your concern, and that's our intention.
Okay. The second question, the lightning round. What are the administration's priorities for the incoming federal relief dollars? Example, if it's 1.1 or 1.3 or whatever that number is, showed up at City Hall today, would be great. What are the top 5 things you think the administration would want to put that money in? And how would you utilize it?
So we want to use that money to make sure that we stay in balance, that our 5-year plan works. And I mean, for us, that's the number 1 through 5 priority, to make sure that the number gets us to a place where we're balanced while, not having to make painful cuts or painful decisions on the tax side.
The only thing I would add is that, the administration has started talking about our priorities for the FY22 budget. And so the ones listed there are health equity for all, quality education for all, a safer and more just Philadelphia, inclusive economy and thriving neighborhoods, and doing that all with a diverse, efficient, effective, inclusive government. So, I think none of those are surprises, but being able to do that is, those outside dollars is what keeps us in balance to be able to advance those.
And so in general, though, getting back to the budget issue, we're $450 million potential projection shortfall for fiscal year 22. Mm-hmm. And if I'm reading it correctly, is the revenue shortfall about 200 to 250 million and the expense overage is 200 million? Is that pretty accurate, or am I not accurate on that?
We'll have to sort of titrate that out a little, but generally, yes, that seems like the right ballpark, and so that's what we'll be considering.
So in that light, I'm going to ask Sarah. Thanks for being here, Sarah. You can give us kind of a reconciliation on COVID dollars we received from the federal government, COVID dollars we from the city, just to make sure we're in balance.
I'm sorry. I couldn't quite hear what you said, but if Marissa or Rob, I will.
Yeah, I think I got it. You want to know what we
Okay.
got and what we spent.
Yeah, reconciliation of COVID dollars we spent or still we received.
Yep, and I think what we'll probably show is what we got and what we've allocated, because spending takes a little longer, but we've fully allocated our funds.
Last but not least, is it on your radar that whatever the numbers are that we get from the federal government, if we get money, that I think we should do a budget with expecting no money, like plan for the worst, hope for the best. We should do a budget without any money from the feds and just see where we are at that point. But if we do get money, is there some small percentage the administration would consider investing into our tax structure in order to, again, help the existing businesses in our city recover and going forward, give us a tool to help expand that economic base?
I think discussions about our tax structure have to be part of the FY22 budget process. Hopefully, if we get federal money, that is something that will help in that conversation. But I think either way, it's got to be part of the conversation.
Because I think what we're seeing now and what you're seeing is this wage tax of the non-residents who don't live here. Could hurt us dramatically because we're again, that concept of taxing things that can move. That's what we need to look at going forward for a healthier city.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments from my colleagues for today's hearing? Okay. Well, I want to thank each of you for being here today and for your ongoing oversight of our city's finances. And hopefully we'll have you back here real soon for another round of questions. But we appreciate your testimony today and look forward to working with you as things progress. I want to thank everybody for being in the hearing today. I don't believe there's any public questions. So I think we can move forward and conclude the hearing. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.